In 2026, the public conversation about China in the West was almost entirely focused on Taiwan, TikTok, and whether the supply chains for consumer electronics were too concentrated in a potential adversary's territory. These were real concerns. They were also, from the perspective of 2103, the wrong frame entirely. The strategic competition that mattered was playing out in commodity markets, infrastructure investment, and manufacturing capacity, and it was largely over by the time the public in the West understood it as a competition. The Belt and Road Initiative, which was being discussed in 2026 primarily as a debt trap diplomacy controversy, had by that point involved infrastructure investment or financing in 147 countries. The returns on that investment were not primarily financial. They were strategic, port access, political relationships, commodity supply agreements, and the alignment of infrastructure standards in participating countries with Chinese technical specifications, which created long-term dependency on Chinese maintenance, components, and technical support. The mineral supply chain story was the most consequential and the least covered. China had established dominant positions in the processing capacity for rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and other critical minerals by the early 2020s. Processing capacity is different from resource ownership. It's the capacity to convert raw materials into usable industrial inputs. In 2026, approximately 80% of global rare earth processing and roughly 60% of lithium processing occurred in or through Chinese-controlled facilities. The electric vehicle transition, which the West was pursuing as an environmental and energy security measure, had an ironic structure. The batteries required for EV production depended on supply chains where China held dominant positions in processing, manufacturing, and in some cases resource ownership. Decarbonizing Western transportation infrastructure required deepening dependence on Chinese supply chains. This was documented and widely known in 2026. The alternatives required a decade of investment and political commitment that materialized unevenly. The semiconductor contest was the one that received the most Western attention, primarily because TSMC in Taiwan became a focal point of geopolitical anxiety. The CHIPS Act investments in the US and similar measures in the EU were genuine efforts to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. They were expensive, slow, and starting from a significantly degraded baseline. Decades of manufacturing offshoring had taken the supply chain skills and the supplier networks with it. Rebuilding took until the early 2040s to show meaningful results. The African development story is where the long game was clearest in retrospect. Between 2013 and 2030, China became the largest bilateral infrastructure financier in Africa. The projects were real: ports, roads, rail, power plants, telecommunications. They were also structured in ways that created long-term economic relationships and, in some cases, political alignment that Western institutions had not anticipated and could not easily counter with equivalent offers. The West competed with criticism. China competed with infrastructure. What the West did well in the 2026 to 2040 period was technology development in AI, II, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. The competitive advantage in fundamental research remained significant. The problem was the gap between research and manufacturing scale. Producing a technology breakthrough in a university laboratory in the US and manufacturing it at scale, competitively, in a global market, those were two different capabilities, and the second had been systematically atrophied. By 2050, the global economic order had reorganized around a multipolar structure rather than the US dominant unipolar moment of 1991 to 2010. China did not replace the US as a global hegemon in the way that Cold War framing would have predicted. What emerged was more complex, a world of contested supply chains, competing infrastructure systems, and regional economic blocs with overlapping dependencies. The Taiwan question was resolved through a negotiated status that satisfied neither side and avoided a war that would have been catastrophic. In 2103, the world economy is not a Chinese world. It is a world in which Chinese manufacturing, infrastructure, and resource processing decisions remain consequential in ways that constrain the choices of other actors, including in domains, climate technology deployment, medical manufacturing, where the constraint has had serious humanitarian consequences. The winning happened over 40 years of patient capital allocation. The loss happened over the same period of strategic inconsistency. The phrase China won is not quite right. The right formulation is, China played a consistent 40-year game, and the West played an inconsistent 10-year cycle of election cycles and shareholder quarters. The outcome was not foreordained. It was structural. The structures that determined it were visible in 2026 to anyone who looked at the infrastructure maps and the supply chain diagrams and the processing capacity statistics. Most people were looking at TikTok,